Hi there, I'm Sashi Sivaram Krishna and welcome to my course Macroeconomics, a Modern Money Theory Perspective. We are in part 1 of the course Macroeconomics and Money. In lecture 11, we will move from stabilization policies to issues related to growth and development. In our last lecture, we looked at the re-emergence of classical thinking. This period that followed under several new schools of classical thought actually witnessed robust growth in GDP. As you can see from the graph, the GDP of the United States rose from about $7.5 trillion in 1985 all the way up to about $11 trillion by 2007. At the same time, inflation was kept at low and stable rates, not exceeding 4%. If you look at unemployment, the darker dotted lines, you see that it's always consistently above 4%. So in a sense, monetary policy was used in such a way that the labor markets did not heat up. Unemployment levels were kept above 4%, so there was always an excess supply or a reserve army of unemployed people in the labor market. This was actually considered as a victory of monetary policy and what came to be known as the Great Moderation touted the argument that monetary policy could be effectively used in order to tame the business cycle, and there was no reason to use aggressive fiscal policy. All this changed when the 2007-2008 global financial crisis struck the United States and pulled the economy down into what came to be known as the Great Recession. Although the United States responded with different measures to counter the global financial crisis and also utilized fiscal policy aggressively. In fact, fiscal deficits reached more than 10% of GDP. The world did not return to a period of fiscal expansion in general. A few years after the global financial crisis was brought under control, we saw a return once again to fiscal conservatism and austerity measures in many parts of the world. Although stabilization policies have been the focus of macroeconomic discourse, growth is considered to be sometimes more important than mere stabilization of the economy, because longer-term improvements in standards of living can occur only through sustained and robust growth in aggregate output, or what we call as gross domestic product or GDP. But how does the aggregate output increase? One could be through increases in the size of the labor force. So simply more hands at work would ensure that the economy produces a larger output. It could also happen through an increase in the working hours by labor. But this is not the way that we would want an economy to grow, because that might not really improve standards of living when people have to work harder and work more hours. Instead, what we would like to see is an increase in productivity, where the average output produced per worker increases. So you could have an increase in the labor force, but at the same time output must grow at an even higher rate so that the average product of labor actually increases. But how does this happen? How do we increase productivity at an economy-wide scale? This can happen through investment in capital, both physical capital as well as human capital. So for instance, if workers have better technology to work with, new technology, they could increase their average product. So you need physical capital, but at the same time you need to be able to operate this new technology, which might require new training, new skills, education, and so on. So the country has to also invest in human capital. The question now is, how do we sustain innovation as well as technological improvements over a longer period of time? And there are two views on this. The first being, it can happen only when there is an exogenous assistance to the private sector. The other, that growth through innovation and technological improvements happens endogenously. It's automatic in a free market capitalist economy. The exogenous thinking comes from a Keynesian view that the government would have to invest in laboratories, in industrial research, in scientific research, and then share this with the private sector through subsidies and through schemes and so on. And the private sector need not invest large amounts in research and development. The endogenous view is that if we can have competitive markets, then improvements in technology and innovation would be a part of how firms have to survive in markets, ensure that they make what we call as supernormal profits, and therefore would invest in appropriate technologies and also undertake scientific and industrial research. So if growth can be endogenous, then the government can focus on providing public goods, including healthcare and education, and leave innovation and technology to the private sector. And this is very similar to the classical school of thought, as we have seen earlier, that the government focuses its attention only in the provision of public goods rather than managing the business cycle, or in this case, managing growth. So from shorter run stabilization to longer term growth, macroeconomic discourse moves on to the issue of development. Development is wider and deeper concept than growth and entails not just increases in output and output per worker, but also a more all-round improvement in levels of education, in the levels of public health, gender equality, environmental sustainability, and so on. The classical thinking on development is fairly straightforward and argues that if there is sustained increase in GDP, then governments can collect a higher amount of tax revenues, which can then be spent on infrastructure as well as public health, education, human capital, and thereby improve standards of living. The key policy to aid development is what we call as structural reforms. And going back to what we said in earlier lectures, this is unleashing the productive forces in an economy through removal of supply side constraints. All this culminated in a document called the Washington Consensus, which outlines the complete classical policies that are required not merely for stabilization and growth, but also for longer term development of a country.